Why were useless rectangular recesses made in the megaliths? What do the unusually high, leveled walls in the quarry indicate? And could all of this be a much older structure that was later simply used for stone extraction? The quarry is located along the slope of Yanmen Mountain. It is believed to have been used since at least the 6th Dynasty's period. However, most of the work at Yangshan is attributed to a wave of construction after the founding of the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century AD. As the story goes, the emperor's son ordered the construction of a giant stele for the Ming Shaoling Mausoleum. The quarry on Yanmen Mountain was chosen by the stonemasons of the city. They are said to have carved and shaped 3 massive blocks from the side of the mountain. However, they eventually concluded that the blocks they had cut were too large. At that point, they abandoned the effort in favor of a more realistic project. How large were these blocks? The stele that these stonemasons eventually created for the emperor stands 6.7 meters tall. According to the original design, it would have been more than 8 times taller and more than 310 times heavier. For example, the largest moved monolith in the ancient and modern world is the 18th century Thunderstone in Russia. If we take this story at face value, as it is presented, it should raise alarm for several reasons. What could have made the emperor's stonemasons believe that they could transport 3 blocks with a combined weight of 31,000 tons over 20 kilometers through the mountains? How could the construction of the emperor's grand gift to his father have been entrusted to such an utterly incompetent group? Especially considering that these were numerous, colossal mistakes that took place over a very long period and involved a significant number of people. It seems absurd that the work wasn't stopped almost immediately, let alone started in the first place. Limestone from there was used for several centuries, particularly for city walls, memorial steles, and statues. In other words, the craftsman had immense experience not only in stone carving but also in its transportation. So how could they have made such a mistake? Moreover, this isn't the kind of mistake you can accidentally overlook. Creating such blocks would have taken many years and an incredible amount of effort. As a result, we have 3 almost completed megaliths, the largest of which weighs 16,000 tons, 10 times heavier than the heaviest block from the Baalbek quarries, and the longest, at 50 meters, is more than twice as long as the longest block from Baalbek. What's interesting is the significant differences in size, placement, and shape of the blocks. It seems as though they were never meant to be placed together or even moved. It's also important to consider the prolonged conflict with the Mongols at that time, which consumed most of the resources and attention. This tense period doesn't seem like an appropriate time to start one of the most grandiose engineering projects known to humanity, a project that would have been nothing more than a work of art. Let's look at the actual stele that was erected at that time. Finding it is not easy, as there are many steles here, and they all look very similar, but it's obvious that neither it nor any of the others compare to the blocks from the quarry. This is a strange aspect of the official version. Instead of a gigantic stele, they erected the most ordinary one. The blocks were left as they were in the quarry, in an almost final state, which reminds us of Baalbek and the Aswan Obelisk. All 3 megaliths are roughly at the same level of completion. Another feature is the very definition of the purpose of the 3 blocks. A stele typically consists of 3 elements: a tortoise base, a rectangular pillar on top of it, and a capstone. Archaeologists consider the heaviest block, not the one with protrusions that indeed resembles a tortoise, especially from above, to be the tortoise base. The block with protrusions, on the other hand, is considered the capstone. However, to be precise, the base was not always made in the shape of a tortoise, but on the replaced stele, it is represented as such. Therefore, we assume that it became a small copy of the original project. The shape of the block considered to be the capstone is the least suitable for a capstone. How did they plan to move the blocks? I couldn't find any information about the methods and route of transportation. Judging by the map, the optimal route from the quarry to Nanjing would be about 17 kilometers long. To deliver the megaliths to the mausoleum, they would not only need to cover this distance but also lower the load by 100 meters and then raise it at least 20 meters. Additionally, in the first kilometer of the route from the quarry, the load would need to be lowered by 60 meters. The architects and logisticians of Emperor Yongle must have understood this in advance. The quarry itself is also unique. Its walls bear the same tool marks as the megaliths. From top to bottom, we see precise manual workmanship. This is where it gets interesting. In what case would the quarry walls be worked in this way? Either intentionally or as a byproduct of previous iterations of stone extraction. Deliberately working the walls like this is not only labor-intensive but also reduces the safety of the quarry. A stone the size of a matchbox falling from the top of such a wall could kill a person, and a person falling from such a height would not get up again. The remaining possibility is that these marks are a byproduct of previous work in the quarry. Judging by the uniform shape and treatment of the vertical slopes, the only suitable option is that similar giant blocks were cut from this quarry. One of the particularly strange aspects of this site is how much stone appears to have been removed. Looking at the space between the main blocks and the surrounding mountains, it seems that millions of tons of material were taken away. It's known that there was a quarry in this area for some time, but this explanation hardly accounts for the staggering amount of stone that seems to have been moved. This leads us to speculate, and looking at aerial photos makes this easy to imagine, that these aren't the only large blocks that were cut here. Based on measurements, it's possible that about 30 such blocks could have been extracted from this quarry. Ancient and modern open quarries are typically characterized by multiple levels and step-like traces, which are formed during the process of stone extraction. This approach is convenient and safe because it protects against landslides and allows for the installation of equipment and the transportation of blocks. Additionally, a high wall would severely complicate, if not make impossible, further expansion of the quarry. Usually, quarries themselves resemble archaeological excavations. In them, one can trace the change in technologies, the sequence of actions, and reconstruct their history over time. In our case, this is not so. It seems that all the work was done in parallel, and the main product was megaliths weighing tens of thousands of tons. Was Yangshan more than just a quarry? A survey of the site reveals many areas that would never have appeared if this place were simply a quarry, or at least a quarry of our time. On one of the megaliths, we see numerous ledges. It's possible they were intended for attaching ropes. But notice their chaotic arrangement. And why are they made so unevenly if the people who worked on this were capable of making smooth surfaces and clearly knew how to handle their tools? It's also important to note that these protrusions are present only on one of the 3 blocks. But if we assume that these megaliths were made at the same time by the same people, why do they differ so much? Another important point concerns the rectangular niches. According to the main theory, they were made to separate the blocks from the rock. But in that case, why go to the additional effort of leveling the walls and creating right angles in the niches? This is an extremely difficult task if we assume it was all done with just a pickaxe. For example, in the niche under the longest megalith, we see rectangular protrusions that seem like they were once lintels, as seen in other megaliths. But then why are there no traces of them at the top? How were they cut so precisely that no trace remains? And here another important question arises. If the upper part of the block doesn't collapse with such a large cutout niche, then why make several rectangular niches in a smaller block instead of one large one? Why all this extra effort? But that's not all. As can be seen on the same block, a smooth, rounded recess is carved on one side. And on the other side, there's another strange cutout in a place where it's absolutely useless. And all this was done with a pickaxe. So much effort was wasted. We should not forget that just a few hundred miles from here are the Longyou Caves, considered one of the largest engineering feats of the ancient world, although no one can determine who built them and why. A similar amount of stone was moved in the Yangshan area. The Longyou Caves bear the same tool marks. This place is further shrouded in mystery because China maintains a high level of secrecy around some of its most peculiar ancient ruins. Many sites are completely closed to visitors, and it is generally almost impossible to obtain permission to excavate or study any historical site. What's even more troubling and strange is that the existence of some megalithic monuments is simply denied. For example, the hundreds of pyramids that dot China's landscape were unknown until recently. Initially, these structures were thought to be a handful of small mounds from the Han era. To this day, areas with the largest and most intriguing structures remain off-limits. A few well-known mounds are open to the public, and it is explained that any other pyramid-like structures are exactly the same as those that can be seen. So, we are left with an implausible official version. We see a sterile quarry with no distinct work area, no partially cut small blocks, no step-like structures along the walls, no technical facilities, fixtures, or auxiliary spaces. The quarry contains 3 nearly finished blocks of phenomenal size. We found a single method of processing, which appears almost final, on both the blocks and the walls of the quarry. Most importantly, we found no mention of blocks of this size being used anywhere in China. Strange discrepancies are repeated in other ancient civilizations that created megaliths. For example, there are many similar questions about the quarries in Egypt. Traces of what tool were left on the granite? And why does the official theory of using dolerite balls not withstand any criticism? At first glance, the official history of the creation of obelisks seems quite plausible. But there are some facts for which it offers no explanation. Almost all known obelisks were made from pink granite, which was quarried near the first cataract of the Nile. The Egyptians began extracting pink granite from these quarries during the Old Kingdom, and possibly even earlier. Pink granite was undoubtedly a special stone for the ancient Egyptians. It was used to create the most important architectural and sculptural forms. The largest of these were the obelisks. The technology of producing sacred stone pillars included 3 stages: cutting the monolith from the mother rock and polishing it, transporting it to the construction site, and finally, erecting it. All 3 technological stages are considered to be quite well known, as a number of written sources have survived to this day, describing the production of obelisks and a set of images from burial structures and temples depicting different stages of this process. Look at this section of the quarry. These are the marks left there by the classic Egyptian method of stone extraction. And next to it is something completely different, requiring much more labor for no apparent reason. Let's discuss the usual method first. It is believed that the stone cutting process was carried out as follows. First, holes were chiseled into the rock in a straight line. Then, wooden wedges were driven into these holes and soaked with water. The wood would swell and fracture the stone. The resulting blocks were then leveled using saws and, if necessary, polished. After this method, the quarry had a stepped structure with clearly visible traces of the wedges. The ancient Roman historian Pliny the Elder mentions that the process of sawing stone was done using thin saws, under which fine sand was constantly added to act as an abrasive. The transportation of stone blocks was carried out using wooden sledges, under which water or liquefied mud was poured to improve sliding. Numerous depictions of such sledges are well known both in art and in archaeological finds. This method was used to move the stone over short distances. Long-distance transport was carried out on the Nile using special barges, which were towed by smaller rowing boats. When transporting large monoliths, several dozen of these boats could be used. The installation of the obelisk was done using an inclined ramp, which was a brick structure divided into numerous compartments filled with sand and rubble. The ramp had a very slight incline and, consequently, was very long. The obelisk was dragged up the ramp, bottom end first, and erected onto the pedestal. It would seem that this historical issue is well studied and leaves little room for doubt. However, facts are stubborn things, especially those that lie, quite literally, on the surface. A significant portion of the ancient Aswan quarries has been absorbed by the modern city of Aswan. In these granite quarries lies the only unfinished obelisk in Egypt, which remains partially attached to the mother rock. This obelisk raises a number of paradoxical questions that modern science cannot answer. First and foremost, it should be noted that this is the largest known obelisk in Egypt, with a length of 41.8 meters. The Aswan obelisk bears no inscriptions, making it impossible to date. However, due to its enormous size, it is attributed to the time of the Old Kingdom. The obelisk is situated on the surface and lies at a slight angle, following the direction of the granite layers. Around the entire perimeter, the monolith is surrounded by a narrow trench less than 1 meter wide, which follows the contour of the obelisk. This suggests that the obelisk was carved out of the rock, with the work being done from above rather than from the sides. What tool was used here? Clearly, The use of saws is out of the question. The sides of the obelisk and the surrounding trench bear traces of a large, rounded tool. The width of the trace is 27 centimeters. In the late 1980s, Italian researcher A. Preti suggested that the marks were left by a rotating milling tool used by the ancient Egyptians to carve the monolith out of the rock. But where could the ancients have obtained such a tool? Similar marks can be found on many horizontal surfaces around the obelisk. These marks resemble those made by a giant chisel. But can we imagine a chisel with a 30 centimeters cutting edge, slicing through granite as if it were clay? On the monolith itself, there are also numerous saw marks and traditional wedge-splitting techniques. However, these marks were clearly made in later times and did not cause significant damage to the monolith. The attempts to split or saw it were unsuccessful. It is believed that the Aswan Obelisk remained unfinished because a mistake was made during the work, causing the monolith to crack. Indeed, a longitudinal crack runs across the upper part of the obelisk, compromising its integrity. However, the cause of this fracture may not necessarily be due to errors by the builders. It could have been the result of an earthquake, for example. It's unfair to accuse the ancient engineers of being foolish or careless when they managed to complete such a significant amount of work, especially since we don't fully understand how they solved this technical challenge. Moreover, the problem can be posed differently. If the ancients carved such a monolith, they must have intended to transport and erect it somewhere. This raises additional questions. First, how could the monolith, situated within the rock and surrounded by a narrow trench, be separated from the rock? The obelisk lies on the bedrock, with only its bottom side remaining attached. How could saws be used in such a situation? How could they saw through 40 meters of granite horizontally without disturbing the flat plane or causing the monolith to crack under its own weight? Different figures are cited in the literature for the weight of the Aswan monolith, but they generally hover around 1,200 tons. This makes it the heaviest man-made monolith in the world. However, it's not entirely clear why this figure is used. Clearly, such a giant cannot be weighed directly, so its weight is calculated mathematically. Although the obelisk remains unseparated from the rock, its planned dimensions are well known. It has a square cross-section with sides of 4.2 meters. These sides run parallel along its entire length, narrowing only at the top to form a point. Given the average density of granite at 2,600 kilograms per cubic meter, it's easy to calculate the weight of the monument. Even without considering a minor adjustment for the tapered top, the calculated weight of the Aswan Obelisk should be closer to 1,900 tons rather than 1,200 tons. Clearly, nothing comparable to the Aswan Obelisk existed in either the ancient world or in modern human history. And the ancient engineers intended to move such a monolith somewhere, and then erect it. The Guinness Book of World Records is full of examples where individuals have single-handedly moved heavy trucks, airplanes, and railway cars. But in all these cases, the loads were placed on wheels and had to be moved across a flat, horizontal surface. How could one solve the problem of transporting a solid monolith weighing nearly 1,900 tons across uneven, mountainous terrain? And the mysteries surrounding the Aswan Obelisk don't end there. Just a few meters from the obelisk are two vertical shafts or wells, drilled vertically into the granite rock. These wells are approximately 3 to 4 meters deep and about 80 centimeters in diameter. The shape of the openings is somewhere between a circle and a square. Inspectors from the Antiquities Service working in Aswan explained that these wells were drilled by the Egyptians to determine the direction of cracks in the rock mass. Perhaps this explanation is correct, as there are not just 2 but about 10 such wells in the quarry area. But the question remains, what tool was used for this? The fact is, the walls of the wells have a smooth, uniform surface without any chipping marks, giving the impression that the rock was simply removed using a device similar to those used for drilling wells today. Except here, we're dealing with granite. The art of working with this hard volcanic rock reached unprecedented heights in ancient Egypt. And it evokes not only respect but also amazement. Indeed, it's impossible to explain everything by the principle of perseverance and hard work will grind everything down. That's not enough. The surviving examples of ancient Egyptian granite architecture demonstrate not only a very high level of processing and construction technology, but also indicate that the ancients possessed fairly advanced knowledge in the natural sciences. Moreover, the closer we get to the origins of Egyptian civilization, the higher these indicators become. According to the official version, not only the Aswan Obelisk but also many other structures in Egypt were shaped using dolerite stones. This is supported by the fact that such stones could leave similar marks. However, it's unclear why these particular marks are square-shaped, measuring 30 by 30 centimeters. It's also puzzling why some of these marks are found in areas where there was no need to remove the stone using such a labor-intensive method, especially since the Egyptians knew how to split granite with wedges. The quarry contains many traces of wedge use, which resemble the classic manual granite extraction techniques of that time. Interestingly, the theory of using dolerite stones is also substantiated by the fact that many such stones were found in the quarry itself. But in reality, they are natural inclusions in the granite rock. In other words, they were present in the quarry as a byproduct of granite extraction. Crucially, in areas with these marks, the dolerite inclusions in the granite were often cut along with the main mass of stone. There was no question of them being chipped out of the granite. When examining the construction technology demonstrated by the monuments on the Giza Plateau, we can see that it was never surpassed or improved upon later. On the contrary, there is a clear process of deterioration in many aspects of early Egyptian civilization, which we observe in the 3rd millennium BC during the period of the Old Kingdom. The very phenomenon of such a cultural complex emerging, with a well-organized system of hieroglyphic writing, a developed calendar, and advanced monumental construction technology, is truly astonishing. In this context, the ideas of those researchers who believe that ancient Egypt was the heir to an even older and more advanced civilization, of which very few traces remain, seem entirely plausible and appropriate. But such traces do exist. They simply need to be recognized, studied, and correctly interpreted. Thank you for your interest in ancient structures. Please subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Feel free to like the video or leave a comment if you wish.